The sun was already bleeding
Thank
out
you.
over the Kansas plain when Clara Marsh saw him.
You're
He
welcome.
was slumped against the
It will
cedar
heal
post of
soon.
her south fence, one hand wrapped around the split rail like it was the only thing keeping him upright, which, as it turned out, it was. His horse stood a few feet off, reins trailing in the dust, too tired to wander. The man's shirt was dark at the left side, and not from the sunset. Clara had been closing the chicken coop for the night. She still had the latch pin in her hand when she stopped walking. 8 months of living alone on 200 acres had sharpened her instincts past what most people would call caution and straight into something colder. She knew the sound of a horse that had been ridden too hard. She knew the look of a man who had run out of choices somewhere between the last town and this fence post. She also knew she had a loaded rifle inside the door and a shovel leaning against the barn wall, and that neither of those facts required her to feel afraid. She studied him for a long moment. He didn't move. His hat had fallen, and his face, angular, weather-carved, older than his body seemed, was turned toward the ground as if he were ashamed of needing to stop. She walked toward him. She did not go back for the rifle. She would wonder about that later, why she didn't. She had no answer that satisfied her, then or after. Some instincts don't come from fear. Some come from something quieter and harder to name. "Can you stand?" she asked, when she was close enough to see his breathing. He lifted his head. His eyes, gray as creek stone, found hers. "I can try," he said. She let him try. He made it halfway before his knees decided otherwise. Clara caught his arm, not because she was tender, but because she didn't want him bleeding further into her fence post. She made him one offer. "What?" "The barn. You can sleep in the barn. I'll bring water and something to wrap that wound. Come morning, you tell me where you're headed and you head there." He nodded. He didn't thank her. She respected that. She had no way of knowing, not then, that by morning, nothing about this would be simple. "Stay with me." Because what Clara Marsh was about to uncover would shake the ground she stood on, and what this man was hiding would turn out to be the most dangerous truth in Harlan Creek. To understand what Clara did that evening, and why it mattered, you first have to understand what her life had become in the months since Thomas Marsh died. Thomas had gone quietly. That was the cruel part. Not a fight, not a fall from a horse, not the kind of death that at least gave you something to be angry at. A fever in February, and then the ground was too frozen to bury him for 11 days. Clara had kept the fire going and the livestock alive and the grief somewhere behind her sternum where it wouldn't interfere with what needed doing. That was Clara Marsh in one sentence. She kept the grief behind her sternum and did what needed doing. The homestead, 193 acres of creek-fed grassland in Harlan County, deeded in Thomas's name in 1871, was hers by law and by 8 years of shared labor. The county clerk, Mr. Horace Finch, had explained this to her with the particular brand of slowness men reserved for women they assumed couldn't read. Clara had smiled and asked him to point to the line on the deed that named her. He had. She had thanked him and left. But the land and the law were separate from the town's opinion of what a widow alone ought to do. By April, Dale Pruitt, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county and had been quietly eyeing the marshland for 2 years, had made her an offer in writing. Polite language, low number. Clara had sent it back and signed with a note that said, "Not for sale. Not now. Not to you." By June, the offers had stopped, but the pressure had shifted shape. Suddenly, the grain merchant extended her credit terms from 30 days to 15. Suddenly, the well-drilling crew she'd hired was unavailable through the fall. Suddenly, the women at the Methodist Social had a great deal to say, in gentle voices, about how hard it must be, alone, and wasn't it time she thought about her future. What they meant was, sell, remarry, or disappear. What they didn't understand was that Clara had already made peace with hardship. The only thing that still had the power to wound her was pity. She had her routine. Dawn to dusk. Fence repair, water hauling, preserving the last of the summer harvest. She had 43 head of cattle and a part-time arrangement with a young Osage man named Samuel Two Creeks, who helped her with the heavier work and whom the town had never quite forgiven her for hiring. Clara trusted Samuel's judgment over most men she'd met, and said so when asked. She was not friendless. She was not broken. But she was alone in the way that doesn't announce itself, The kind that only becomes visible at dusk, when the work is finished and the house is quiet and there is no voice anywhere that knows your name. That was the woman who walked toward a bleeding stranger at her fence line on a Thursday evening in October of 1879. She wasn't looking to save anyone. She had learned, by then, to be careful with that impulse. What she didn't know was that the man slumped against her cedar post had been running from something that had already touched her life, something that had a name she knew, a face she'd seen at church, and a deed she had filed at that very county clerk's office. The world before the secret always looks ordinary from the inside. His name, he told her, was Cole. Just Cole. No last name offered, none asked for. That was an old courtesy of the frontier, one Clara understood and didn't push against. The wound was a through and through on the left side, below the ribs. Whoever had done it had used a rifle, not a pistol. The entry was clean, the exit uglier, but nothing vital had been struck. Clara knew enough about wounds to know the difference. She had dressed worse on cattle. She had dressed worse on Thomas, after a fence wire incident in the summer of '76 that he had never fully admitted to her was his own fault. She brought a lantern, a clean flour sack she tore into strips, and a jar of the turpentine and pine tar salve her mother had sworn by. She didn't ask him how it happened. Not yet. He sat on a hay bale without complaint and let her work. His jaw was set and his eyes stayed fixed on the middle distance, the particular expression of a man practicing being somewhere else in his mind. But he didn't flinch, and he didn't make a sound she didn't hear, and when she tied off the last strip, he looked down at the bandage with something that crossed his face too quickly to name. "You've done this before," he said. "Not a question," she answered. "No." She picked up the lantern. "There's a water bucket by the south wall and a wool blanket on the nail above it. The bay horse in the second stall doesn't like strangers. Don't try to make friends with her tonight." She turned to leave. "Why didn't you send for the sheriff?" he asked. Clara paused at the barn door, her back still to him. "I haven't decided yet," she said. And that was the truth, or most of it. The part she didn't say was that she'd looked at his hands while she worked. A man's hands tell you things his mouth won't. His were calloused on the inside of the thumb and the first two fingers, the way a man gets from rope work, not cards. His right knuckle bore an old scar from what looked like a branding iron's edge. His nails were clean, which meant, even in hard circumstances, he had habits of care. She had learned to read men from the ground up. Thomas had taught her that, without meaning to. She went back to the house and sat at the table for a long time before she slept. Over the next 3 days, Cole did something she hadn't expected. He worked. Not because she asked. She brought him broth and cornbread the first morning and found him already attempting to rehang the barn's sagging south door with one good arm and a length of wire. By the second day he was splitting wood, slowly, resting between swings, but splitting it. By the third morning, he had noticed that the east fence had 3 posts leaning at bad angles and had started resetting them with the methodical patience of someone who understood land the way ranchers do, not as scenery, but as responsibility. He didn't make conversation. He didn't linger. He stayed out of the house and out of her way, and when their paths crossed, he gave her what space the property allowed. But Clara noticed things. She always had. He knew, without being told, which soil near the creek was too soft to hold a post. He read the cattle the way you only do if you've spent years doing it, not watching them, but seeing them. One afternoon she found him crouched near the young heifer who'd been off her feed, examining her gum line with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. "She's got early signs of grass tetany," he said, without looking up. "You have any magnesium supplement in the supply shed?" "Yes," Clara said, because she did. "How do you know that?" He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers. "Spent some years ranching." "Where?" "The beat." "Just a half-second too long." "North of here," he said. And he walked back to the fence line. Clara watched him go. A drifter didn't know grass tetany. A man passing through didn't reset fence posts with that particular kind of care. The care of someone who understood that a fence wasn't just a boundary, it was a promise made to the land. Cole was not simply a man who had run out of road. He was a man hiding inside the shape of one. On the 4th day, Clara rode into Harlan Creek for supplies. She tied her horse at the post in front of Geller's general store, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of tobacco, dried beans, and the particular sharpness of fresh-cut pine, and began working through her list. Flour, lamp oil, a paper of needles, dried navy beans if Geller still had them, which he often didn't by October. It was while she was waiting for Geller to weigh out the flour that she saw it. Tacked to the wooden board beside the door, between a notice about a lost mule and a church social announcement, was a wanted circular. They came through Harlan Creek irregularly. The county sheriff posted them when the marshal's office sent them down from Wichita. This one was printed on rough paper, the ink slightly smeared at one corner, and the face in the illustration was rendered in the blunt, imprecise lines that characterized most frontier printing. But Clara had spent 3 days looking at that face. Older in the drawing. Harder. The jaw sharper in the illustration than the man she knew because wanted circulars always stripped a face of whatever softened it. But the gray eyes, even in ink, even in that crude rendering, were unmistakable. The name printed above the illustration was not Cole. It read, Lycade. Below that, wanted in connection with the robbery of the Caldwell Cattlemen's Bank, August 14, 1879. Armed and considered dangerous. Reward, $400. Clara did not touch the notice. She did not change her expression. She had learned that skill during the months after Thomas died, when the town had watched her face for signs of collapse. She had given them nothing then, and she gave nothing now. She paid for her supplies, said her usual number of words to Geller, and untied her horse. She rode the 4 miles back to the homestead at an even pace. The whole way, her mind ran the numbers on what she knew. Caldwell was 120 miles southwest of Harlan Creek. The robbery had been in August. He'd appeared at her fence in October. 2 months was long enough to ride a long, indirect route, especially if you were hiding. The wound was consistent with a chase, not a simple fall. And the $400 printed at the bottom of that notice was not an insignificant sum. It was what Clara owed to the grain merchant and the bank combined. It was, in other words, exactly enough to save the homestead for another year. She unsaddled her horse and stood in the yard for a long moment, facing the barn. She could hear him working inside. The rhythmic sound of a broom on the dirt floor. $400. She went inside and started a fire for supper and did not go to the barn. She lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, and the question she turned over in her mind was not should I report him. She had already run that answer and found it simple. The question that kept her awake was harder. What kind of man robs a bank and then spends 3 days resetting fence posts for a woman he doesn't owe anything to? She had no answer yet. But she intended to get one. The next morning, Clara did not go to the sheriff's office. She waited until he came in from the east pasture. She'd seen him checking the cattle at first light through the kitchen window, before she'd even put the coffee on, and she set 2 cups on the table outside the kitchen door, on the edge of the sun-bleached porch where Thomas used to sit on cool mornings, and she waited. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw the cups. He read the situation correctly. She could see it in the way his shoulders shifted, and he came to the porch. He sat across from her. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He didn't drink. I went to town yesterday, Clara said. I know. Then you know what I saw. He looked at her steadily. I know what that notice says. Is your name Eli Cade? The pause. Not long but honest. Yes. Clara nodded slowly. She had expected the confirmation and still felt the weight of it land somewhere in her chest. Tell me about the bank, she said. He told her some of it. He told her that there had been 3 men. That he had been one of them. That the plan had been to ride in, take the cash drawer, ride out. No one hurt, a quick crime with a clean exit. He said this the way men sometimes do when they're confessing, selecting the facts that explain the action without exposing the whole of the reason behind it. What he did not tell her, not yet, was why. Who had organized the job. Who the money had been meant for. Why a man who clearly knew cattle and land and hard work had ended up standing in a bank in Caldwell with a gun and 2 strangers in August. He stopped where it was still defensible. Clara recognized the shape of it, the partial truth, the story that answers the question you asked but not the one underneath it. She had seen Thomas do it about smaller things. About the horse he'd paid too much for. About the letter from his brother he hadn't wanted to explain. "So you're wanted," she said. "Yes. And you came to my fence line because you were out of options." "Yes. And the $400 on that notice." She looked at him. "That doesn't concern you? That I might need it?" Something moved behind his eyes. "Not offense. Something more careful." "It concerns me a great deal," he said. She stood up, took both cups, made her decision with the information she had, which was not enough, but she didn't know that yet. "You'll leave by Sunday," she said. "That's 4 days. I won't report you. But I won't hide you either. If the deputy rides through, you're on your own." He stood too. "That's more than fair." "It's not about fair," Clara said. "It's about what I can live with." She went inside. She thought she had drawn a clean line. She thought she understood the situation. On Saturday morning, she discovered she understood almost none of it, because Deputy Ray Colfax rode up the drive just after breakfast, and he wasn't looking for Eli Cade. He was looking for Clara. Deputy Ray Colfax was not a bad man, but he was the kind of man who carried other people's interests in his chest pocket like a folded letter, always there, always shaping which way he leaned. Those interests, Clara had come to understand over years in Harlan Creek, belonged in large part to Dale Pruitt. Colfax touched the brim of his hat at the porch steps. "Morning, Mrs. Marsh. Wanted to ask you something if you've got a moment." "I have a moment," Clara said. "You had any strangers pass through?" "Someone came through the Hensley place 2 nights ago and spooked their dogs." "Could be nothing, but with that Caldwell business, the marshal's asking folks to keep their eyes open." Clara looked at him. "I've had no strangers." It was not the truth. She knew that when she said it. What she didn't know was that telling it would force the rest of the story into the open within the hour. After Colfax rode away, she went to the barn. Eli was gone. His bedroll was gone. His saddlebag, which he had kept on a hook inside the stall door, was gone. His horse was gone from the paddock. He had heard Colfax coming and made the choice she hadn't made for him. She stood in the empty stall for a long moment. The wool blanket she had left him was folded neatly on the hay bale. That was the detail that stopped her, the folded blanket. The small, deliberate courtesy of a man who understood what it meant to leave a space as you found it. She turned to go. The saddlebag was not gone. It was tucked behind the post, partially covered by loose hay, as though it had slipped or been left deliberately. She pulled it out. It was old leather, dark from years of use, the buckle repaired with a length of copper wire. She should not have opened it. She knew that. She opened it. Inside, a change of shirt, a small amount of hard money wrapped in cloth, a folding knife, and at the bottom, folded 3 times and soft from handling, a letter. The letter was dated June 12, 1879. It was addressed to Eli, no last name. It was written in a careful, formal hand that Clara recognized after she read the first 3 lines. Because the signature at the bottom was a name she knew. Harlan Pruitt, Dale Pruitt's younger brother, who had died, according to the county, according to Dale Pruitt's own testimony at the inquest, in a riding accident in July. The letter was postmarked June. Harlan Pruitt had written it alive, 2 months before his supposed accident. Clara sat down on the hay bale and read it twice. The story that came clear was not the story she had been told, not by the wanted circular, not by Eli, not by Harlan Creek itself. Harlan Pruitt had borrowed money from his brother Dale to purchase a small parcel near the creek. Dale had formalized the loan with a private deed of trust, the kind that, if the loan went unpaid, transferred the parcel to Dale without any county filing. It was legal, barely, in Kansas in 1879. It was also the exact mechanism being used, the letter suggested, against at least 2 other landowners in the county. Clara's name was not in the letter, but Thomas Marsh's name was. The Caldwell Bank that had been robbed, as local accounts in the letter described it, held the private notes on those deeds. Notes that, if recovered, would expose what Dale Pruitt had been quietly assembling for years. Eli Cade and 2 others had not robbed that bank for cash. They had robbed it for paper. And Harlan Pruitt, who had organized the job, who had believed those documents could be used to free the men his brother had trapped, had died 6 weeks later in a riding accident, that no one in Harlan Creek had thought to question. Clara sat with that letter for a long time. Stay with me. Because what she did next, with this letter in her hands and a deputy who had just ridden away and a wanted man who had left her his truth folded at the bottom of a saddlebag, is the thing that told the rest of her life who she was. Clara had until sundown to decide. That was not a deadline anyone had given her. It was the one she set herself, the way she always had. Thomas used to say she made decisions the way she hung fence. Slowly, deliberately, and so firmly that nothing short of a hard winter was going to move them afterward. She put the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it while she drank her coffee. The options were not complicated. They were simply all of them costly. She could take the letter to Deputy Colfax. That was the obvious choice. The legal one, the safe one, the one that would get Eli Cade arrested and likely hanged, the $400 reward paid, and the whole quiet machinery of Dale Pruitt's business interests left perfectly undisturbed because the one man who could tie Pruitt to Harlan's death was behind bars. The letter would be dismissed as a dead man's grievance. Clara would be seen as a good, cooperative widow, and the pressure on her land would probably ease, for a season. Until Pruitt found another angle. She could do nothing. Burn the letter, forget the saddlebag, let the whole thing settle back into silence. That was also a choice, and one that required a kind of courage she didn't have, the courage to live with what you knew and chose not to carry. Or she could find Eli Cade. She stood up from the table. She was not a woman given to dramatic gestures. She didn't feel her heart racing the way they described it in the novels the minister's wife passed around. What she felt was the specific, focused clarity that came when she stopped debating and recognized the only action she could take without becoming someone she didn't recognize. She knew two things with certainty. The first was that Eli had left her the letter on purpose. He hadn't forgotten it. A man that careful didn't forget. He had left it because he'd calculated that she could use it and he no longer could, because the moment Colfax appeared, Eli Cade had become a man with no legal standing and no voice that any court in Kansas would hear. The second thing she knew was that Thomas's name was in that letter, and that meant whatever Pruitt had been building had already touched her land, her debt, her life, had perhaps been shaping the terms of her survival without her knowledge for years. This was not someone else's fight. She packed the letter carefully into the bodice of her riding coat. She saddled the roan mare, not the bay, who'd never forgive her for a hard ride, and she went to Samuel Two Creeks first, because he was the most honest man she knew and because he had grown up in this county and knew every trail, every creek bend, every place a man on a blood bay horse with a fresh wound might shelter. Samuel listened. He didn't ask her why she was doing it. He told her about a line camp 3 miles northeast, abandoned since a cattle operation folded the previous winter, where the chimney still drew and the door still latched. Is this going to bring trouble to you? Clara asked him. Samuel looked at her for a moment. Trouble's already here, he said. You're just the one deciding what to do with it. She found Eli at the line camp before noon. He was sitting outside on an overturned crate, cleaning his rifle, which told her his side was still painful enough that he needed to stay still. He looked up when she rode in and went very still himself. She dismounted. She reached into her coat and put the letter on the crate beside him. He looked at it. Then at her. You read it, he said. Yes. Then you know I can't use it. I know you can't, Clara said. You're a wanted man. But I'm a homesteader with a deed filed at that county office, and my husband's name is in that letter, and Dale Pruitt has been running a land scheme in this county for 2 years. She looked at him steadily. I'm not wanted for anything. He was quiet for a long moment. The autumn wind moved through the dry grass around the camp. Somewhere nearby, a meadowlark, the last stubborn one of the season, called once and went silent. You'd be walking into something with no clean ending, Eli said. I'm already in it, Clara answered. I've been in it since February, and I didn't know it. He picked up the letter. He read it again, not because he didn't know what it said, but because, she thought, he was looking for something. Maybe for whether to believe she meant what she said. Maybe for what it cost her to mean it. He set it down. There's a circuit judge out of Wichita, he said slowly. A man named Ferris. He's not Pruitt's man. If you could get that letter and the deed records to him before Pruitt knows what you have, how long do we have? Colfax will report that he came to your place and you said nothing. When Pruitt hears that, he'll wonder. He'll want to move quickly." "How long?" she repeated. Eli looked at her. 3 days. Maybe less. Clara took the letter back. "Then we'd better use them." She was not afraid. That was the truth of it, the hard, quiet truth she would remember afterward when people asked her how she had done it. She had not been brave in the shaking, trembling way people imagine. She had simply, finally, run out of patience for being afraid. The circuit judge, Honorable George Ferris, received Clara Marsh in his temporary chambers at the Harlan Creek courthouse on the following Tuesday morning, a cold day in late October with frost on the window panes and the smell of coal smoke drifting through the hall. Clara brought the letter. She brought the deed of trust she had found, with Eli's careful directions, filed in a secondary record book at the county clerk's office, the one Horace Finch apparently didn't expect women to request. She brought a written statement she had composed herself, in her own hand, laying out what she knew, what she could prove, and what she was asking the court to examine. She did not bring Eli Cade. That had been their agreement, and she had kept it. Judge Ferris read everything without speaking. He was a compact, gray-haired man with the kind of measured expression that gave away nothing while giving, Clara sensed, nothing away. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "are you aware that the man who provided some of this information is wanted in connection with the Caldwell robbery?" "I am," Clara said. "I'm also aware that the documents taken from that bank, which I did not receive and do not have, apparently named Dale Pruitt as party to a private deed scheme operating in at least 3 land parcels in this county. I'm bringing you what I found on my own property, in my own barn, with my late husband's name in it. What you do with it is your jurisdiction. What I'm telling you is the truth." Ferris looked at her for a long moment. "Do you have a lawyer, Mrs. Marsh?" "I can't afford one," she said. "But I can read and I can write, and I've been managing 200 acres alone for 8 months. I think I can manage this." Something shifted in the judge's expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the look of a man who had reconsidered something. What followed did not happen overnight. That would be too simple, and the truth was not simple. Dale Pruitt was not arrested. Not at first. What happened was slower and, in some ways, more permanent. Judge Ferris ordered a full audit of the county deed records. 2 of the landowners named in Harlan Pruitt's letter, a German immigrant farmer named Strasse and an older widow named Betts, had the terms of their private loans re-examined under territorial law. Harlan Pruitt's riding accident was referred to the state marshal's office for review. It was, as local memory tells it, enough to dismantle what Pruitt had built, not dramatically, not in one courtroom moment, but in the slow, grinding way that law sometimes works when someone with nothing to lose and everything to fight for puts the right paper in the right hands. The warrant for Eli Cade was not dropped. Clara had not expected it to be. What she had asked Judge Ferris in the last 2 minutes of that meeting was whether a man who had acted to expose a land fraud, at personal risk, without compensation, might be considered differently under the law than a man who had robbed a bank for profit. Ferris had not answered her. But he had written something down. 8 months later, as the story passed through Harlan Creek in fragments and whispers over the following years, it was said that Eli Cade surrendered to the marshal's office in Wichita in the spring of 1880, with a letter from Judge Ferris already on file. The charges were reduced. He served 14 months. Clara Marsh was at the courthouse steps in Wichita when he came out, on a morning in June 1881 when the Kansas sky was the particular shade of blue that only happens after a long, difficult winter finally releases its hold. She had driven the wagon up herself. 2 days' ride. She had told no one in Harlan Creek where she was going. He saw her from the top of the steps. He came down slowly, the way a man does who isn't sure of his welcome and is trying not to assume. She handed him the reins of the spare horse she had brought. "I thought you might need a ride back," she said. He looked at the horse. Then at her. "Back to Harlan Creek?" he said. "Back to the homestead," she said. "If you're willing to work for wages. The east fence needs resetting again, and I've got 47 head now going into summer." He was quiet for a moment. A long one. Then he took the reins. "I'm willing," he said. They rode out of Wichita side by side, into the flat, sun-bleached expanse of the Kansas plain. They didn't say much. There was a great deal in the years ahead that they would say, in the mornings on the porch, in the slow conversations that grow between two people who have each seen the other make a hard choice and not flinch from it. But on that June morning, riding through the tall grass with the whole sky ahead of them, the silence was enough. It was the kind of silence that comes after something has broken and the pieces have been set right. Not perfectly, not without scars, but firmly. The homestead was still standing. The deed was still in her name. The cattle were healthy, the fence was holding, and the East Creek hadn't flooded that spring. What Clara Marsh had built was not the life she had planned. But it was hers, every acre of it, every hard-won inch. And now, for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might also be a beginning. The West, in those years, had a way of doing that to people who refused to leave. It ground them down. It took from them, often. But for the ones who stayed, who read the deed, fought the clerk, drove 2 days for someone worth fighting for, it sometimes gave something back that had no name in the law books. Call it a future. Call it justice. Call it the particular, stubborn grace of starting over on ground you earned. Clara Marsh called it home.